So you want to do an assessment. Okay, well, what is an assessment? ITIL defines an assessment as the formal mechanism for comparing operational processes to performance standards. An assessment is a baseline measurement, and we use assessments in a number of ways and for a number of reasons. We might want to assess our people and our culture. We might want to assess process efficiency and effectiveness. We might want to assess technology, or we might want to assess our maturity. And that includes the maturity of our processes, the maturity of our organization, the maturity of our governance, and the maturity of our business alignment. So we use assessments for a multiple of reasons. The first thing that we've got to do when we are undertaking an assessment is understand why. I want you to go back to our CSI approach, and if you remember in our CSI approach, our first step in that approach was to understand the vision. In other words, why? Why do you want to assess? That's a really important question to answer, because quite simply, if you don't understand why, then how will you know what to assess? I've already given you a list on the previous slide that came up of the types of assessment that we might undertake and what we might assess. Well, how do you know what to assess if you don't know why you are assessing? There are lots of advantages and lots of risks as well to assessments. Think about when you're undertaking an assessment, what it is you want to achieve, why you want to achieve it, and that will tell you whether these advantages are going to be relevant to you. Assessments, as I've already told you, are a baseline measurement, and we can assess at the beginning of a project and we assess at the end of a project or improvement initiative to tell us whether we have achieved that improvement. But an assessment only provides a snapshot. It is a point-in-time measurement. Now, if we undertake many assessments, if we undertake multiple assessments, one after another, on an iterative basis, right the way throughout a project, then it will show us progress. But an assessment that is only just taken once will not show progress. So again, I take us back to the question of why. And on the screen in front of you right now, then you do have a list of both the advantages and the risks that are involved with assessments. And these have to be evaluated before you undertake any assessment project. So let's look at why. Why do you want to do this? Well, you might want to compare yourself to industry standards or to best practice. Or you might want to compare yourself to competitors. You might want to demonstrate adherence to industry standards or adherence to a best practice framework. Or you might want to demonstrate that competitive edge. You might want to use an assessment to identify improvement opportunities. And of course, you'll use an assessment to provide reassurance of your improvement progress. But you have to think about the relevance of your assessment. Think about why. Otherwise, an assessment is just a metric. And as we all know here in IT, we like to measure just for the sake of measuring sometimes, and that's not what we want our assessment to do. We also have to think about, when we're considering relevance, if we are assessing our processes, just think about where we actually need our processes to be in terms of maturity. Do we really want all of our processes to be well developed and mature? No, we don't. What we actually want is for our processes to be at the maturity level that is needed by the organization. And the screen that's showing in front of you now is just a very simple example of what we call value versus maturity. Processes that have high value and high importance to you as a service provider, your organization, well, they should be mature. But those processes that you are not utilizing, processes that are not particularly important to you as a service provider organization, well, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be there, but what I'm saying is that they don't necessarily need to be as mature. Now, why would I make a statement like that? It's because quite simply, when we are prioritising improvement initiatives, when we are prioritising, say, implementation of ITIL, you have to know where to start. And again, this is another reason why we need to look at the why we want to assess. Think about those processes that perhaps aren't as mature in your organisation and ask yourself the question, do they need to be mature? Not all processes need to be at the same level of maturity. So we use assessments to benchmark, and by benchmark I mean compare. And we use that to compare against industry standards, we use that to compare against best practice, we use it to compare against our competitors. In order to make that comparison though, you need to ensure that you have an impartial perspective when benchmarking. You need to ensure that you've got senior management support, and that you're actually comparing the processes themselves and not the outputs. That's a very important step, the processes. In other words, how you work and not what your output is. Especially if you're comparing against, say, the industry standard, your outputs may be different to the rest of the industry. So please don't compare outputs. We compare the actual process themselves. And of course, you have to involve the process owners. And whilst we'll say it should be impartial, yes, it should, but it should also be done with the involvement of all of the stakeholders of the process, because only they can give a full, well-rounded 360-degree view of the actual process that you are evaluating. If you want to undertake a benchmark internally, there's no reason why you shouldn't, especially if you're benchmarking one particular business unit against another business unit, one particular service provider unit against another, then in that case, then yes, you would want to do that internally, but make sure that the person that is performing the benchmark has the right skills to be able to do that. Identify your problem areas. Identify what it is you want to benchmark, what it is you want to compare. And then on the screen in front of you now, and you can pause this video at any point in time to get this information, then on the screen in front of you now, you'll see that there are a varying number of techniques for obtaining information. You can use any one of those. If you want to know more about those, then please contact me at the email address that'll be at the end of this video, and I will be able to help you with any of these particular techniques that we use within assessments and within benchmarking. So why do we use benchmarking then? Why do we compare to our industry? Why do we compare to our competitors? Well, there are three main reasons why we use benchmarking, and the two really are very, very important. We want to use it as a lever to make change. See, look, we are not doing as well as our competitors are, so we need to make change. Or actually, we're doing really, really well at this particular process, so we want to make change in other processes to meet the maturity of the one that we are very impressed with. That's what we call benchmarking as a lever, and then we also have benchmarking as a steering instrument. And as a steering instrument, well, that's used to drive direction. What we mean by that is that's used to tell us what areas we need to improve, what areas we need to concentrate on. And rather than comparing against industry standards, in this instance, we may compare against other processes within our organization, within our service provider organization to do this. And think about the categories of that benchmark. What are we comparing to? Are we comparing to industry standards, or are we comparing to our competitors, or are we comparing to other services or other units within our organization? That will tell us whether we're using this benchmark as a lever or as a steering instrument. Now, the question that I'm often asked is, should we publish the results of our benchmark? Well, that's entirely up to you, but we will tell you that we want you to be transparent. Think about governance and the ITIL principle of governance, which is governance with control, with fairness and transparency. So yes, we want to ensure that we are transparent in our endeavours. And if we are looking to improve, then as part of that improvement initiative, surely we want to be transparent as to where we are right now and where we want to go. We may also use assessments to help us with a gap analysis. Now, a gap analysis is not necessarily anything to do with benchmarking, although the benchmarking can give us well, if we use it as a steering instrument, it can give us an end result, something that we want to achieve, an improvement initiative. And in that case, then, we would use that assessment along with our chosen directives and our priorities to produce a gap analysis. Our assessment is where we are right now, and our priorities are where we want to be. And here we have then a gap analysis. And a gap analysis, well, that's the technique that we would use to look at, or compare rather, where we are right now to where we want to be, and then work out our priorities for how we're going to get there. Analyze that gap. And we can do that with our organisation and with our culture. We can look at that from a perspective of our organisation itself and from governance, from policies. We can do that with our processes and also with our services and our tools as well. Now, I mentioned maturity, and we like to use within ITIL, we like to use the CMMI, which is Carnegie Mellon's maturity model for assessing our processes. And you'll see there that on the screen in front of you now, this comes straight from Carnegie Mellon and the CMMI Institute, and you'll see that we have 5 different levels of process maturity. We start off with number 1 at the bottom, which is initial. And what that means is that it's a very, very ad hoc process. And we have varying levels of maturity right the way through to optimizing, which is level 5. Optimizing means that we have put CSI in place for that process. When we're performing an assessment against a process, we will invariably use CMMI to tell us exactly where we are right now. And then we will compare. In other words, we will benchmark. We will compare against maybe industry sectors or against competitors or against other different units within the service provider organisation, and that will give us our gap analysis. So where we are in terms of maturity, where the rest of the organisation is in terms of maturity for a particular process, and that will give us our gap analysis. In other words, where do we want to be? I expect, and there's an example coming up very briefly on the screen in front of you. This is just an example of a CMMI assessment, and I expect you to be able to perform that, or any external assessor to be able to perform that and produce this for any process within your service management framework. And that's what we will use to identify not only areas for improvement, but to also identify the maturity versus value, which again is another exercise that I expect you to do as part of your improvement initiative. So when we're doing assessments, what is it that we assess? Well, I talked about CMMI a lot, and so that means that we can assess processes, and we can just assess the processes. Or we can assess the processes and we assess the people and the technology that we use to facilitate the processes. And then we can also do what we call a full assessment. Now, people assessment will look at skills and will look at talent, as it were. Whereas full assessment will also look at culture, will look at decision making. And a full assessment will allow us to identify, well, areas of resistance, and allows us to identify opportunities for improvement, not just in process maturity, but also in the maturity of our service provider organisation as a whole. A full assessment can be quite an investment from an organisation's perspective. However, What I tend to find is that a lot of organizations will look at a process-only assessment and realize very, very quickly that that will not actually drive improvement, because until we address the skills of our people and until we address our organizational culture as a service provider, then improvement will only go so far, and maturity can only be developed to a certain point until we address those aspects. So lastly, before we leave this particular session, then when do we actually undertake an assessment? Well, I've already said to you, as part of any improvement, when we've decided that we want to implement improvement, when we've decided that we want to do better, then at that stage, during our planning stage, that's when we would take an assessment. That is our baseline. And then we can baseline, we can take an assessment throughout the project, throughout the improvement, and we should also undertake another assessment at the end of an improvement initiative, and that will tell us whether we have improved or not. Now remember, and before I leave you, I want to take you back to CSI and continual service improvement, and remember that continual service improvement means just that, continual. And improvement is not just a one-off initiative that you simply do and then walk away and declare that that's it, everything's working fine. Our organisation changes, our business changes, and therefore our alignment to our organisation has to change also, which means that we must be continually seeking to improve. And so assessments have to be done on an iterative, a continual basis in order for them to be effective. If the topic of assessments has interested you, if you'd like to know any more information about how to undertake assessments or the techniques that we can use when performing assessment or benchmarking activities, then please get in touch at the email address below and I'll be happy to help you as best as I can.